It only took 3 seconds for everything to go dark, 3 seconds for my entire house to fall silent, and about 5 more before I realized. This wasn't an outage. This was personal, and the people standing outside my yard already knew it. I remember sitting there, staring at my monitor as it flickered out, my coffee still warm in my hand, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel natural settling in like a warning you don't fully understand yet. And then I looked out the window, and there they were. 3 of them, standing just past the property line like they were admiring my lawn, nodding at nothing, hands behind their backs like they had all the time in the world, the HOA board. Now, I'd had issues with them before, nothing dramatic at first, just passive-aggressive emails about aesthetic consistency and community standards, the usual suburban theater, but it escalated when I converted my garage into a home office. Nothing illegal, nothing loud, no traffic, just me, a desk, and a secured connection to the kind of systems you don't casually mention at block parties. Still, they didn't like it. Said it made the neighborhood feel commercial. One of them, Diane Mercer, the HOA president, actually stood in my driveway a month earlier and told me, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "This isn't a tech park, Mr. Hale. It's a community." I told her I worked remotely, like half the country, and she just nodded slowly like she'd already decided something. So when my internet died that afternoon, I didn't panic, not right away. I've worked in cybersecurity long enough to know systems fail, signals drop, hardware glitches. It happens. But something about the timing, the silence, and especially the fact that every single device dropped at once, that didn't sit right. I stood up, walked over to the router, saw the lights blinking rapidly like it was trying to hold on to something before they just stopped. No power surge, no storm, no warning. Just cut. I stepped outside, and the air felt different. Or maybe that was just me already connecting dots I couldn't yet prove. The 3 HOA members were still there, now pretending to examine a hedge along the shared boundary. Diane was there, along with Carl Benson, who always acted like he'd been given authority he didn't quite deserve, and Linda Shaw, who rarely spoke but watched everything. I gave them a nod, casual, like nothing was wrong. Diane smiled again, that same rehearsed expression. "Afternoon, Ethan," she said. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I looked at her for a second longer than necessary, then said, "Depends on what you're measuring." Carl chuckled like he didn't get it, which, honestly, he probably didn't. I walked past them toward the side of the house where the junction box was mounted. It's one of those things you don't think about until you have to. Just a panel, slightly weathered, blending into the exterior. I opened it, and right away I knew. The cable was cleanly cut. Not frayed, not damaged, cut. Precision, intention, and whoever did it knew exactly where to do it, so the entire line would drop without affecting anything visible from the outside. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, looking at it, feeling that slow shift from confusion to clarity, the kind that settles in your chest and doesn't leave. Then I turned my head slightly, just enough to see them still standing there, still pretending. And in that moment, something clicked. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about aesthetics. This was about control, and maybe something else, something more personal. I went back inside, grabbed my phone, and started documenting everything. Photos of the cut, the angle, the placement, the box itself. I took wide shots, close-ups, even the ground nearby. There were faint impressions in the dirt, not clear footprints, but enough disturbance to suggest someone had been there recently. I checked the time, took note of it, then walked back out again, this time with purpose. "Something wrong?" Diane asked, like she hadn't already rehearsed that line in her head. I looked at her, then at the others. "Cable's been cut," I said plainly. No accusation, just fact. Carl frowned, overly dramatic. "Cut? That sounds serious." "It is," I replied, holding his gaze just long enough to make it uncomfortable. Linda finally spoke, her voice quiet but sharp. "Well, maybe it was installed improperly. These things happen." I almost smiled. "Not like this," I said. "This was deliberate." There was a pause, brief but telling. Diane stepped forward slightly, hands clasped. "Ethan, we did send you a notice earlier this week. About that line. It may not comply with community guidelines." I let that sit for a second. "The line is underground," I said. "It's not visible. It doesn't affect anything." She tilted her head. "That's not entirely accurate." I didn't argue. Not yet. Instead, I nodded slowly, like I was considering her words, then said, "I'll review the notice again." And I did. That night, after restoring a temporary connection through a backup system, I pulled up the document they'd sent. At first glance, it looked official enough, formatted, signed, stamped with the HOA header. But the more I read, the more things started to unravel. Dates that didn't align, references to bylaws I'd never seen, clauses that contradicted each other. And the signature. Diane's name was there, but the style was slightly off, like someone had tried to replicate it without fully understanding the rhythm. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, feeling that familiar shift in perspective I used to get during investigations. Patterns emerging where others might see noise. This wasn't just sloppy paperwork. This was constructed and rushed. And that's when I started to wonder how far they were willing to go and how far they already had. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was stressed, but because something about the whole situation had flipped a switch in my head, the kind that doesn't turn off once it's triggered. I kept going back to the same question over and over again. Why go this far? I mean, people argue with HOAs all the time about paint colors, fences, mailbox heights, but cutting a line? That's not enforcement, that's escalation. And escalation always comes from somewhere. Around 2 in the morning, I got up, made another cup of coffee, and sat back down at my desk, the glow of the monitors cutting through the dark like I was back on a late-night ops shift. I pulled up the HOA portal, the one they used for community transparency. Public documents, meeting notes, budget summaries, the kind of stuff meant to make everything look clean and accountable. But systems like that, especially ones managed by people who think delete actually means gone, tend to leave behind more than they realize. Now, I want to be clear about something. I didn't hack anything. I didn't break into secured systems or bypass protections. Everything I accessed was publicly available or poorly archived, the kind of oversight that happens when people don't expect anyone to look too closely. And I looked closely. At first, it was just routine. I cross-referenced the notice they sent me with previous documents, bylaws, amendments, archived versions. That's when the inconsistencies started stacking up. The clause they cited about visible infrastructure disruption, it didn't exist in any official version of the bylaws. Not current, not past. It was inserted, poorly, like someone had taken a real document and tried to graft something onto it without understanding the structure. Then there were the timestamps. The notice was dated Monday morning, but the file metadata, still intact in the upload history, showed it was created late Sunday night. Not unusual on its own, but when I compared it to the meeting minutes from the previous week, there was no mention of any discussion about my property, no vote, no motion, nothing. For something they claimed was a formal enforcement action, it had no procedural footprint. And then I found the messages. They weren't where you'd expect them to be. Not in a chat log or a forum thread, but buried in a version history file attached to a draft document. Someone had used the portal's built-in editor to collaborate on a notice, and the system, for reasons I'm guessing they never bothered to understand, kept a record of every revision, including comments that were supposed to be temporary. At first, it was just fragments. A sentence here, a suggestion there. But then I saw a name, Carl, followed by a comment. If we push this through before he notices, we can shut it down. No context, just that line. I scrolled further. Diane had replied, "Do it clean. No warnings this time. He'll fight it if we give him time." My fingers hovered over the keyboard, not typing, just still. There's a moment in any investigation where suspicion turns into confirmation, and it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like gravity, like everything just got heavier. I kept going. Linda had added a note later that night. Cable runs along east side. Boxes exposed. Easy access. And then Carl again, a few minutes after that. Good. Once it's cut, he can't work. He'll have to comply. I leaned back, exhaled slowly, and just stared at the screen. There it was. Not speculation, not assumption, intent. Clear, documented, time-stamped intent. And the thing that got me wasn't even the plan itself. It was how casual they sounded. Like they were discussing lawn maintenance. Like disrupting someone's livelihood was just another checkbox on a list. I saved everything. Screenshots, raw files, metadata. I exported the entire revision history, preserved the original timestamps, even captured the access logs showing who edited what and when. Years in cybersecurity teaches you one thing above all else. If you're going to present evidence, it has to be airtight. No gaps, no assumptions, no room for interpretation. By sunrise, I had the foundation of something solid. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Because there was one more layer to this, and it was the one they clearly hadn't considered. My work. See, I don't usually talk about what I do in detail. Not because it's classified in some dramatic, movie-like way, but because it's easier to just keep things simple. Remote analyst sounds harmless enough, and most people don't ask follow-up questions. But the reality is, the systems I connect to, the networks I monitor, they're part of a federal infrastructure. Not public-facing, not optional. And the connection I use from home? It's secured, registered, and logged. Which means when that line was cut, it didn't just disconnect my house. It interrupted a monitored access point tied to federal operations. I pulled up my own logs next. Secure access records, connection drops, system alerts. Right there, time-stamped within seconds of the cable being severed, was a flagged interruption. Not critical, not catastrophic, but enough to trigger a notice. Enough to be recorded. I sat there for a while, just looking at it, letting the implications settle in. They thought they were enforcing a neighborhood rule. What they actually did was interfere with a federal communication line. Now, I'm not the kind of person who jumps straight to escalation. I believe in giving people a chance to explain themselves, to correct mistakes. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was planned, executed. And then, they stood outside my house, pretending to admire a hedge. So I made a decision. I compiled everything into a single report. Clean, structured, chronological. I started with the physical evidence, the cut cable, the location, the documentation. Then the HOA notice, with all its inconsistencies highlighted and cross-referenced. Then the internal messages, preserved exactly as they appeared, with metadata intact. And finally, the system logs showing the interruption and its classification. I didn't embellish. I didn't speculate. I just laid it out. Then I sent it. Not to the HOA. Not to a lawyer. To my agency's internal legal team. The response came faster than I expected. Within a few hours, I had a reply requesting a formal statement, along with confirmation that the incident would be reviewed under potential interference statutes. The language was careful, precise, but the message was clear. This had moved beyond a neighborhood dispute. Later that afternoon, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Diane standing there, alone this time. No Carl, no Linda. Just her, holding a folder, that same composed expression on her face, but something about it felt different. Tighter, like she was trying to hold something in place. Ethan, she said, her voice measured. I wanted to follow up on the notice. There seems to have been some confusion. I leaned against the doorframe, arms relaxed. Confusion? She nodded. Yes, the board is reviewing the situation. It's possible the enforcement action was premature. I watched her for a second, said. The cable was cut this morning. Her eyes flickered. Just for a moment. Yes, I heard about that. Unfortunate. Unfortunate. I repeated, letting the word hang there. That's one way to describe it. She shifted slightly, adjusting the folder in her hands. We're looking into it. Of course, if the line was installed in violation of. It wasn't, I said calmly. And you know it wasn't. There was a pause. Not long, but enough. Then she smiled again. Smaller this time. Well, we'll sort it out. I nodded. I'm sure you will. She turned to leave, but stopped halfway down the path, glancing back over her shoulder. Ethan, there's no need to escalate this. We're all neighbors here. I met her gaze. That depends on what you think this is. She didn't respond. Just turned and walked away. I closed the door slowly, there for a second, listening to the quiet again, but it felt different now. Not empty, not uncertain, focused. Because by then, I knew something she didn't. And it was already too late for them to undo what they'd started. The next morning didn't feel dramatic at first. No sirens, no flashing lights, no sense of something big about to unfold. Just a quiet street. The same trimmed lawns, the same mailboxes lined up like nothing had changed, and for a second, I almost wondered if maybe it would all just stall out, get buried in paperwork, turned into one of those things people stop talking about because it gets uncomfortable. But then, around 9:17 a.m., a black SUV rolled into the neighborhood, slow and deliberate, followed by another one about 30 seconds later. And that's when the tone shifted. They didn't rush. That's what stood out to me. The two men who stepped out weren't in uniforms, No visible badges from a distance, just calm, measured movements, like they'd done this 100 times before and didn't need to prove anything to anyone. One of them glanced at the houses, then at a tablet in his hand, and I could tell immediately they weren't here to figure out what happened. They already knew. I stepped out onto my porch as they approached, and one of them gave a small nod. "Mr. Hale," he asked. "That's me. I'm Agent Collins. This is Agent Ramirez. We received your report." There was no small talk, no easing into it. Just acknowledgement and then motion. They asked a few questions, straightforward, confirming details I'd already documented. The cut, the timing, the notice, the individuals involved. I showed them the junction box, the cable, the photos I'd taken. Collins crouched down, examining the cut with a kind of quiet focus, then said, almost to himself, "Clean. Intentional." Ramirez was already reviewing the digital file I'd sent, scrolling through the messages, the metadata, the logs. "You preserved everything properly," he said, glancing up at me. "That helps." "I figured it might," I replied. There was a brief exchange between them, low voices, nothing I could fully hear, and then Collins stood up, dusted his hands lightly, and looked toward the street. "Let's go talk to your neighbors," he said. Now, I won't pretend I didn't feel something in that moment. Not satisfaction, not exactly, but a kind of stillness, like watching a chain reaction you already set in motion finally reach the point where it becomes visible. I followed at a distance as they walked across the yard, past the property line, toward Diane's house. She opened the door before they even knocked. That part stuck with me, like she'd been watching, waiting, hoping maybe she could control the narrative if she got ahead of it. "Good morning," she said, voice steady, but her eyes were already scanning, calculating. "Can I help you?" Agent Collins introduced himself, same calm tone, same minimal expression. "We're here regarding an incident reported yesterday involving potential tampering with a communications line." Diane's smile didn't disappear, but it changed, tightened. "Oh yes, I heard there was some kind of issue. Very unfortunate." Ramirez stepped forward slightly, holding up the tablet. "We have documentation indicating that members of the HOA board may have discussed and acted on this prior to the incident." There it was. No accusation, no raised voice. Just fact. Diane hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Then let's clarify," Collins said. What followed wasn't loud. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation like you'd see in a movie. It was quieter than that, and somehow, that made it heavier. They asked questions, direct ones, about the notice, the bylaws, the timeline, about who drafted the document, who approved it, who had access to the junction box area. Diane answered carefully, choosing her words like each one might be examined under a microscope, which, in a way, they were. Carl showed up about 5 minutes later, walking over from his house with that same half-confident stride he always had, but it faltered when he saw the agents. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Ramirez turned the tablet toward him. "Did you write this comment?" he asked, pointing to the line. "Once it's cut, he can't work." Carl looked at it, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't have an immediate response. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. That could be taken out of context." Collins nodded. "Then give us the context." Linda arrived last. She didn't say much, just stood there, arms crossed, watching everything unfold like she was trying to stay detached from it. Like maybe if she didn't engage, she wouldn't be part of it. But her name was in the logs. Her comment about the cable location, the easy access, it was all there. And one by one, that calm confidence they'd carried around for months, maybe years, started to crack. The agents didn't threaten. They didn't raise their voices. They just presented the evidence. The messages, the altered documents, the system logs showing the interruption tied to a federal access point. And with each piece, the space for denial got smaller and smaller, until it wasn't really space anymore, just silence. At one point, Diane looked over at me. Not directly, not fully, just a glance. And in that glance, there was something I hadn't seen before. Not arrogance, not control. Fear. By the time the conversation ended, the tone had shifted completely. What started as confusion was now being discussed in terms like liability, intent, and interference. The agents issued formal notices, requested full cooperation, and made it clear this wasn't going away quietly. Within 2 days, Diane resigned. No announcement, no farewell email, just a brief update on the HOA portal stating that she was stepping down for personal reasons. Carl stopped attending meetings. Linda, well, she stayed, but she didn't speak much anymore. The board brought in an external management company, new guidelines were drafted, and suddenly, the same people who once argued over mailbox colors were talking about compliance, documentation, and boundaries. As for the cable, it was repaired the same week. Professionally, quietly. No mention of violations, no follow-up notices. Just fixed. And me? I went back to work. That's the strange part, I think. After everything, after the investigation, the reports, the conversations, life didn't become some dramatic aftermath. It just returned to normal. Morning coffee, emails, meetings, the occasional wave from a neighbor who now seemed a little more cautious, a little more aware. But every now and then, I'd catch someone looking at that junction box, just for a second longer than necessary. And I'd wonder what they were thinking. Because here's the thing, what happened wasn't just about a cable. It wasn't even really about the HOA. It was about what people do when they think they have just enough authority to act without consequence, when rules become tools, and community standards turn into something else entirely. I still think about that moment sometimes, standing there, looking at a cleanly cut line, realizing that someone had decided, somewhere along the way, that this was acceptable, that this was justified. And I wonder, if I hadn't had the background I did, if I hadn't known where to look, what to save, how to connect the dots, would they have gotten away with it? Or worse, would they have done it again? So I'll leave you with that. Because situations like this, they don't just happen in one neighborhood or with one group of people. They happen anywhere there's a little power, a little frustration, and no one paying close enough attention. Do you think they crossed a line the moment they cut that cable, or long before that? And if you were in my position, would you have handled it the same way, or let it go to keep the peace? I'm genuinely curious how you see it. Let me know in the comments.